So, where are rates headed in the next few years? Let me preface this by saying that no one can predict for certain what's going to happen. No one can guarantee anything. So, I could totally be wrong. But here's what I think I think rates are likely to stay fairly stable over the next few years, and here's why. We are still fighting inflation. If the Fed lowers the federal funds rate, which is not the mortgage interest rate, by the way, but if they lower the federal funds rate, that would be likely to increase inflation further. Since we're already fighting inflation, we don't want to do that. So I think it's unlikely that the Fed is going to substantially lower the federal funds rate unless the shit hits the fan and the economy starts nosediving. So I mentioned that the federal funds rate is not the mortgage interest rate. So why do people talk about the Fed lowering the rate when they're talking about mortgage interest rates? This is a massive oversimplification, but essentially it is because the rate that the Fed sets, that federal funds rate, that hints at how aggressively they're going to be fighting inflation over the next few years, or at least that's how investors perceive them adjusting the federal funds rate. It's like a hint at what they're going to be doing. So, how aggressively we're trying to reduce inflation is going to affect essentially the ROI that investors get when they invest in long-term investments like the 10-year Treasury bill. So, for example, if we go easy on inflation, then $100 invested today is going to be worth significantly less in 10 years' time. This means that the investor that's going to invest in a 10-year treasury is going to basically want a higher ROI to invest in that 10-year bond. That means that the 10-year bond has to offer a higher rate of return, essentially. This is not exactly how it works. Again, it's an oversimplification and I'm not using exactly the right terms, but to give you an idea of what's going on. So essentially, they're going to want a higher rate of return on that bond in order to be willing to invest in it. So for example, again, these are not real numbers. If you know that your $100 investment here is going to be worth less in the future, 10 years from now, let's say it goes down to $75, just to use round numbers, then you're going to want to get paid out more each year to offset how much less it's going to be worth in 10 years' time. So again, how does all of this relate to mortgages? So most mortgages are bundled into massive bundles that are called mortgage-backed securities, and they're sold kind of like stocks on a market where investors can invest in these buckets called MBSs or mortgage-backed securities. So an investor has an option to invest in a 10-year treasury bill over here, or they can invest in an MBS over here. And if you're wondering why a 10-year treasury specifically, it's because usually mortgages are held for about 7 years before they're either refinanced or, the person moves, sells the house, the mortgage is paid off, they get a new mortgage. So that's why it tracks the 10-year, because it's the next closest thing to how long mortgages are held. But anyways, so they can invest in the 10-year treasury bill over here, or they can invest in an MBS over here. So in order to entice people to invest in these MBSs when they have the option to invest in a 10-year treasury, which is backed by the US government and therefore perceived as less risky, the MBS has to essentially offer a similar but slightly higher rate of return to help offset for the additional risk inherent to investing in bundles of mortgages versus a bond that's backed by the US government. So the rate of return on as the rate of return on the 10-year treasury changes, the mortgage interest rates move kind of in lockstep with that, but slightly higher. So to recap, mortgage rates move in step with the movement of the 10-year treasury, which is affected by how aggressively the Fed is expected to target inflation, which is read into, which basically the federal funds rate is like the signal for how aggressively investors believe that the Fed is going to target inflation over the next few years. And since we are fighting both high-ish inflation and a cooling job market, we're essentially between a rock and a hard place. And the Fed has to walk this narrow path of not reducing rates too much, not increasing them or holding them too high for too long, so that we don't either skyrocket inflation or cool the economy so much that it essentially stalls out. So basically, that is why I think that we are likely to see relatively stable rates for the next several years. I do think there is reason to believe there might be a very slight decrease in rates as we see the economy continue to cool a little bit. Please don't hold out expecting a significant drop from where we are right now. I think it's unlikely to happen in the next few years. Again, could be totally wrong here. I don't have a crystal ball. There's no guarantee. This is just my interpretation of what's going on. But I don't believe that we're going to see a massive decrease in rates anytime soon, because the Fed is essentially walking a tightrope trying to keep the economy from collapsing or creating massive inflation.